about all kinds of stuff. Professor Dave explains.
With ancient Greece covered, it's time to visit another classical civilization, and one that most people immediately think of when they imagine antiquity: ancient Rome. The bulk of what we know about the Roman Republic, the era that began in the 6th century BCE and ended with the creation of an empire in the late 1st century BCE, comes from what the Romans themselves wrote about it. They offer us a version of events in which the city was initially a monarchy, ruled at times by kings from the much more powerful Etruscan Empire at its borders, until after about 250 years it rejected its rulers and became a republic governed by elected officials, a senate of experienced statesmen, and a series of public assemblies that voted on candidates and laws. Our sources then go on to describe the more or less inclusive government of the later Republic, the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE, as the result of concessions made during the 5th and 4th centuries BCE by the patricians, who were the city's rightful aristocracy, to the plebeians, or commoners, who abandoned the city several times in order to force their way into the government, because they were more interested in gaining power for themselves than in supporting their city. The heroes of this story, which came to be known as the conflict of the orders, were the patricians, and its most famous incident has one of them settling a plebeian protest by comparing the aristocrats to a man's stomach and the commoners to his limbs. Though the limbs only exist to supply the stomach, they cannot go off on their own because without it they cannot sustain themselves. In the end, some plebeians were co-opted into the governing class, and by the later republic, the patrician-plebeian distinction had become irrelevant, because the aristocracy was made up of men from both classes. There was, in its place, a conflict between the optimates, or the best men, whose families supplied the senatorial leadership, and the populares, individuals who were themselves aristocrats but courted the support of the city's poorer classes. From descriptions of the Roman state written by contemporary Greeks, we know that its electoral system initially gave much more of a voice to the wealthiest citizens, whose financial and moral worth, like the worth of all male citizens, was determined by officials called censors. A census was carried out every 5 years, which was originally geared toward deciding what sort of army service a man should perform. This depended on his personal wealth because he had to supply his own equipment. The census classes eventually became the basis of the electoral system, so that rather than one man, one vote, Roman citizens voted as blocks of people that shared a single vote between them. And because the aristocracy was divided up into more of these blocks than all the other classes put together, if it voted together, it could sway the outcome of any election. Reforms were made in the 3rd century that reduced the electoral power of the patricians and made the plebeian assembly the main source of new legislation. This changed the situation somewhat, but the power of elected officials paled before that of the Senate, which was composed of the most influential men in the city, including those who had held elective office in the past. This meant that it wielded a great deal of power over the conduct of government, even though its role was supposed to be advisory and it could not pass laws. It also had control of wars and treaties, such that it shaped the course of the Republic's rapidly expanding empire. The Senate tended to represent the ideal of Roman traditionalism, what was called mos maiorum, or the behavior of our ancestors, and its gravitas, the weight of its ancient dignity, most famously represented by Marcus Cato, a politician of the early 2nd century known as the censor. He was a member of one of the city's most prestigious families, and a spokesman for ancient values like farming the land and rejecting foreign influences. Close to the senators in their social status were the equestrians, or knights, who were wealthy enough to be able to buy their own horses when they served in the army. Though they were ranked 2nd highest as a census class, the equestrians did not serve in the Senate. This left them free to pursue businesses other than landowning, which was the only occupation considered appropriate for a senator, and many equestrians were extremely wealthy. The city's most powerful elected officials were the two consuls, who had the sort of executive authority that had belonged to kings before the republic was established. But in order to limit their power, each one had the right to veto the other's decisions, and like most other elected officials, they served for only a year. The consuls convened meetings of the Senate and the various citizen assemblies, and after serving his term, a consul often became a proconsul, who still had a great deal of power, but exercised it as the military commander of a current war, or as the governor of an area that had already been conquered and was now a province, as this was a word that originally meant something like duty or office. After a military victory, the general in charge of the campaign could be honored with a ceremony called a triumph, in which captives, wealth, and works of art taken from the enemy were carried in a public procession, at whose head was the general, even as a slave stood by him to whisper in his ear that he was a mere mortal after all. An illustration of this practice is preserved on the Arch of Titus in Rome, which celebrates the emperor's victory over the Judeans who rebelled in the 1st century CE. In addition to the consuls, there were officials called praetors, who were in charge of the administration of courts, and quaestors, who looked after how the treasury's funds were spent, both in Rome and in the provinces. The city's administration remained limited to a small group of men even once the Republic had expanded across the Mediterranean, and the sort of bureaucracy found in ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia did not develop until much later in Roman history. No effort was made to train administrators in the skills they might need to perform their duties, or to select the people best suited to their positions. The legal system of the Republic was as limited as its bureaucracy. The only written laws were an ancient collection of rules called the 12 Tables, which, according to tradition, was codified early in the Republic so that the plebeians would know their rights. Laws were also occasionally passed by the public assemblies, which could always be annulled at a later time, and the Senate could issue directives that were not legally binding but had all the force of its collective gravitas. There was, in addition to the laws themselves, an edict issued by the praetor each year at the beginning of his term, which set out the rules and principles that judges had to use in deciding cases between litigants. Because the written law was so brief, the praetor had to resort to a great deal of interpretation to apply it to situations that it had not anticipated, and since most or all of a praetor's edict was adopted without changes by his successor, it slowly grew into a body of legal procedure. Only after the end of the Republic did Roman law start to develop into the comprehensive and systematic code it later became. As in Greece, the wealthier members of society were expected to use their assets to serve the general good by paying for public buildings and festivals and giving gifts to the people. This became a problem before elections, when candidates would try to buy the support of poorer voters by sponsoring elaborate games, like gladiatorial combats, at which gifts were distributed, the so-called bread and circuses. So laws were passed in the later Republic that forbade candidates from doing such things too close to an election in which they were running. But actual bribery aside, it was traditional for powerful men to act as patrons for their socially inferior clients. The patron would use his influence to help his clients, while clients were supposed to help their patrons whenever they were called upon. They might, for example, serve as an entourage when their patron was running for public office or needed to demonstrate his social status to his peers. Though the term Roman Empire is often used to describe Rome's growing domination of the Mediterranean world, most of this process took place during the Republican period as territories around the Mediterranean became Roman provinces. The city's expansion began when it started to forge treaties with its neighbors in Italy. It was originally part of a league of communities grouped around a central sanctuary, who were called Latins because they lived on a broad plain, or Latium. Though this region shared a common language and culture, it was also influenced by the Etruscans, who occupied the region of Tuscany to the north. Their culture was entirely different from that of the Latins, because they had arrived in Italy from somewhere else, but the Romans did borrow from them institutions like the toga, the Latin alphabet, and the gods of their traditional religion. Early in its history, Rome came into conflict with the nearest Etruscan cities, in particular the powerful town of Veii, which it defeated in the late 5th century BCE. Another early enemy was the Gauls, who lived in the region of the Rhine and Seine rivers. They invaded both Italy and Greece during the 4th and 3rd centuries and almost destroyed Rome itself in 390. By the 3rd century BCE, Rome had treaties with most of the cities of the Italian peninsula, but these communities were often unhappy with Rome's demands, which included sending soldiers to fight in its wars and giving up its lands to benefit Roman farmers, and many of them rebelled in the early 1st century BCE. In the settlement that followed this war, Roman citizenship was extended throughout Italy. Gaul, just to the north of Italy, was also turned into a series of provinces. In the course of the 2nd century BCE, southern Gaul was invaded and occupied, and in the middle of the 1st, Julius Caesar acquired northern Gaul. The only enemy of the Republican era to pose a direct threat to Rome was the city of Carthage, a Phoenician colony in North Africa which had created its own empire in the western Mediterranean. The conflict between these two states began because Rome was an ally of the Greek cities in Sicily and Spain, whose territory was being hemmed in by Carthaginian expansion. During the Second Punic War, which was fought towards the end of the 3rd century BCE, the Carthaginian general Hannibal invaded Italy and turned several of Rome's allies against it. He also defeated the Roman army at the Battle of Cannae, which the Romans came to consider their greatest military loss. But Hannibal was defeated by the Roman general Scipio, who was given the honorary title Africanus for invading and defeating Carthage itself. In the 2nd century, the Republic destroyed Carthage entirely and incorporated its territory as the province of Africa. During the later 3rd and 2nd centuries, other alliances and friendships, which were informal agreements born of mutual self-interest, brought Rome into conflict with the Antigonids of Macedonia and the Seleucids of Asia Minor. Their territories, along with the independent city-states of the Greek mainland, became the provinces of Achaia, Macedonia, and Asia. In the middle of the 1st century, the general Pompey defeated Mithridates, the king of Pontus, who had been building an empire in what had been Seleucid territory. He also turned the states of the eastern Mediterranean, such as Judea and Armenia, into Roman client kingdoms. The last major addition to the Roman Empire was the province of Egypt, which was annexed by Augustus, the first emperor in 30 BCE at the very start of his regime. Even as it acquired an empire, Rome remained a city. Only people who were born and lived within its physical limits were automatically citizens, and even their status was ambiguous for as long as they lived somewhere else. Though citizenship could be granted to foreigners, as it was, for example, to the family of the Apostle Paul, it was normally reserved for people who were thought to have done Rome some important service. This meant that over the course of the Republic, more and more people were subject to Roman authority without enjoying the rights of citizens. Several kinds of legal status, which the Romans called ius, or right, were invented over time and applied to different groups of foreigners, who passed them on to their descendants. In addition to these varieties of status, there were slaves who had no legal rights at all, though there were limits on how badly they could be treated by their owners, which were gradually expanded as Roman law developed a concept of human rights. Slaves were people from the provinces, since it was illegal to enslave or even beat a Roman citizen. During the Republic, they tended to come from the populations defeated in the wars of Roman expansion, as it was common for slave dealers to accompany the army and seize prisoners of war, whether or not they had been combatants, for sale in markets like the one on the Greek island of Delos. As these wars drew to a close with the end of the Republic, Rome relied more on people born into slavery, since the children of a slave woman also belonged to her master. Because Greek culture and science were well regarded, slaves from the East were often used as teachers, doctors, and writers, but there were also captives from Western or Northern Europe, many of whom worked as field hands or on the household staff of wealthy aristocrats. There were 3 slave rebellions during the 2nd and 1st centuries, the most famous of which was the Spartacus Revolt, led by men who had been forced to serve as gladiators. An important place in Republican society came to be occupied by freedmen, former slaves who became part of their former master's family and often continued to work for it in the same professions they had practiced before. By the later Republic, the small farms of regular citizens had been bought up by the wealthy and turned into large estates worked by slaves. peasants, while the farmers became a poor and disaffected group living in the city, who were often drawn to the populist leaders that promised them land and dignity. Attempts were made to resettle these people by limiting the amount of property that individual citizens could own and distributing the rest to the poor. The leaders of this reform were two brothers named Gracchus, who served as tribunes of the plebs in the later 2nd century BCE. This was an office that had been created early in the Republic to represent the interests of the common folk, and even though by this time the people who held it were part of the aristocracy, it provided a route to power for politicians who were at odds with the senatorial elite. In the end, most of these agricultural reforms failed because they faced strong opposition from the landowning aristocracy. The end of the Republic dragged out across the 1st century BCE, beginning with the Gracchi. A series of popular leaders took power as temporary dictators so that they could introduce the social and economic reforms their supporters wanted. This did not mean they had overthrown the government, as the dictatorship was a traditional republican institution that had been used in the past in times of emergency, but it now began to grow beyond the control of the traditional leadership. Men like Marius, who was a general from a lower-class family, Sulla, who removed Marius from power on behalf of the Senate, and then became a dictator himself. And finally, Julius Caesar, who wielded personal powers at odds with the aristocratic consensus that had been typical of Republican politics. A civil war broke out in the middle of the 1st century, in which Caesar, after defeating the forces of the Republic in 48 BCE, became a permanent dictator who made new laws and election results subject to his personal approval. He also took for himself the power of a plebeian tribune, which allowed him to veto the decisions of the actual tribunes, and a new position called supervisor of morals, which gave him the authority of a censor. He was assassinated by Republicans in 44 BCE, so there is no way to determine whether he would have continued to rule in this way, but we do know a great deal about the Civil War and its aftermath from the writings of Cicero, who was one of the most successful politicians of the late Republic and the most important political philosopher of ancient Rome. After Caesar's assassination, a number of men took power, including his adopted son, Octavian, who by the year 30 had defeated his former ally Mark Antony and begun to establish a reformed government. There is good reason to think that Octavian, who was honored with the name Augustus, had no intention of wiping away the structure and institutions of the Republic, but by the end of his long reign, a hereditary system in which one man held almost supreme power had emerged, which is recognized in hindsight as the beginning of the Roman Empire.
Thanks for watching. Subscribe to my channel for more tutorials. Support me on Patreon so I can keep making content. And as always, feel free to email me, ProfessorDaveExplains@gmail.com.